Revelation chapter 21. This is just, it's an awesome chapter. Chapter 21 and chapter 22 are talking about eternity, our heavenly home, all things new. That's what I put the title on my notes tonight, was All Things New. And it stands in such a stark contrast to chapter 20. Because in chapter 20, even though you still have the millennial reign of Christ in chapter 20, but you've got Satan's final rebellion, the battle of Armageddon, you've got that crushed, and you've got the great white throne, you've got Satan, the false prophet, the Antichrist, and all these people being thrown into the lake of fire. And then you go into chapter 21 and you've got the new heaven and the new earth. But when you think about it, it can't be new without getting rid of Satan and sin. And that's part of what's going to make it new and make it different. Even though during the millennial reign of Christ, the curse is going to be partially done away with, as we read in Isaiah, like chapter 11 and a couple of other places, about how the animals will all be at peace and they won't hurt in all of his holy mountain. When we get to Revelation chapter 21, in the future, when we get there, the curse is going to be completely gone. There will be nothing in this new heaven and this new earth to even remind us of the curse. It's going to be perfect righteousness. So he begins in verse 1, and let's read through verse 8. He begins by saying, "Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and also there was no more sea. And then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. And God himself will be with them and be their God. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, no sorrow, no crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things are passed away. Then he who sat on the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. And he said to me, Write, as not write as in write, but write it down. Write, he said, for these words are true and faithful. And he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, and I will give of the fountain of the water of life freely to him who thirsts. And he who overcomes shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. But the cowardly, unbelieving, abominable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake of fire, which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death." So right away, he gives us two new things. He just said, he says, I've got this vision. Here's what I saw. And the first is a new heaven and a new earth. And then the second is, in verse 2, the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. And a couple of things that you need to remember or think about is, first of all, the holy city, New Jerusalem. In particular, in the Old Testament, all the way through the Old Testament, God says, Jerusalem is mine. This is my place. We even saw in Ezekiel chapter 38 that there's one verse in there where it talks about the Jews, Jerusalem, being at the center of the land or at the center of the earth. And when you look at your footnotes, you'll see that phrase should be literally interpreted the navel of the earth. And that's because it's God's. And so when we get to heaven, to eternity, we're going to see the New Jerusalem. And this is the Jerusalem that God created in heaven. This is the city. Remember, in Hebrews chapter 11, it said that Abraham could have turned around and gone back to Ur of the Chaldees had he not been seeking a city whose builder and maker was God. This is it. This is what he was looking for. When we get to this point, to Revelation chapter 21, everything that we know today is gone. It's over. Everything. This world, and we're going to talk about it in just a minute. There's some arguments about it. this world, the physical world that we live in, everything that humans have built and worked for, all of that's going to be gone. Now, if you turn to 2 Peter, I put it in your notes there, but if you turn to 2 Peter, Peter talks about this, and he tells us, or he describes how it's going to happen. And in chapter 3, beginning in verse 10, Peter says, "But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works in it will be burned up." Okay, and it's that phrase, burned up, that creates the differences in opinion or the doctrinal differences. There is one thought process that says that the earth will be literally destroyed, the heavens and the earth, and they'll just be gone, and then what God will bring in will be a brand new creation. Just start all over. There's another line of thought based on this Greek word that is translated burn up in the New King James. In some of your other translations, it may be translated, and my mind, I just went blank. I looked it up twice before I left. But a lot of renovated, regenerated, replenished is also an idea from this Greek word burned up. That in the English it's two words, in the Greek it's just one word. And so a lot of people think that this fire, that this end time thing that's going to happen, it's not necessarily going to destroy the earth, but it's going to purge it of everything. And I can see, I put in your notes my thoughts on this. Number one, I said I don't think it really matters, because once we get to this point in history, future, we're going to be perfect. We're going to have perfect minds. They're not going to be corrupted. Everything to us, we're going to see things and understand things the way God does, so it's not going to matter. But I put down here, if I were pressed to give an answer, where do I come down on this? I would tend to go with the renewed aspect of it, that the fire is not actually going to destroy the earth, but it's going to purge it, replenish it. And my reasoning is Romans chapter 8. And if you'll go over there if you want to, otherwise I'll just read it to you. In Romans chapter 8, Paul talks about the creation itself, the world, the cosmos. Well, listen to what he says. He says, beginning in verse 18, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of the creation," and that word creation right there is cosmos, the world. "For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God." Now, you go back to Genesis chapter 3, and before sin, before the curse, the world was a perfect paradise. No thorns. You know, I doubt, if there were fire ants, they were nice, gentle things. They weren't what we know of today. If there were mosquitoes, they weren't what we know mosquitoes today. It was a paradise. When Adam went out to till the ground, it just gave forth lush and beautifully. I mean, it was just the perfect place. What we see today and what we experience today is a result of sin and the curse. And Paul tells us here that this creation, he says it was subject to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. So what is the hope that it's waiting for? Verse 21, "Because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage that it's in." So based on that, if I had to say, okay, this is exactly what I believe about this, I believe it's going to be regenerated. I believe the fire is going to go through it. And you've seen, there were a couple of times at the house that I tried to burn not only the countryside, but everything else down. And they come out and they finally get the fire out, and you look out through there and the trees are just charred and everything's just burnt. But folks, in a matter of time, that was probably the best thing could ever happen to it. It just regenerated, and it was so beautiful and lush. And my other thought is, if this world that we live in, this earth, was destroyed and a new one brought in, and I'm not saying the earth has feelings, but Paul says that it groans and it's waiting eagerly. What if we got to Revelation chapter 21 and God said, okay, I know that you're my creation, and I know that you've been waiting eagerly for this expectation, but I'm going to do away with you and bring in a whole new group of people. How would we feel? And Paul says the earth groans and eagerly waits with expectation. So based on all that, I tend to lean toward the regeneration. This fire, it's going to come through, and Peter says it's going to melt the elements, and it's just going to destroy everything. Well, that word destroyed, that's also the same word as in where Jesus says, don't fear man, but fear him who can destroy both the body and soul in hell. Well, when you read the rest of Scripture, they're not literally destroyed, as in they're gone. But it is a destruction. If you think about it, I would hate to experience hell. So when he talks about destroying the heaven and the earth, it's that same thought, that same idea. Now, again, it really doesn't matter, because by the time we get there, we're going to have our new brains, we're going to be perfect. But that is something that comes up. And if you're reading some of your study Bibles, you might see notes about that, or footnotes about, well, this could really mean not necessarily destroyed, but replenished or renewed. Revealed, that's the word I was looking for. Where it says burned up, some of the newer translations say revealed. And the thought is that after the fire burns through, what the earth really is, back to original creation, is going to be revealed, rather than the darkness and the sin that's over it now. And then I put this little comparison in here just for fun, give you something to look at and to think about. When you compare Genesis, especially the first 3 chapters, and then what we're reading here in the book of Revelation. And in Genesis, the heavens and the earth were created. In Revelation, you have a new heaven and a new earth. The sun was created, but in the new heaven and the new earth, there will be no sun. We won't need the sun, and we're going to see why in just a few minutes. Night was established in Genesis chapter 1, verse 5, but in the new heaven and the new earth, there'll be no night. It'll be light all the day long. Somebody said, well, when are we going to sleep? Well, we ain't. You won't need to sleep. You'll be perfect. Seas were created in chapter 1 and verse 10 in Genesis, but then in Revelation 21:1, John says, well, there were no more seas. He said, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. And then he says, and there were no more seas. Now, that's caused a lot of problem for a lot of people. In particular, from a theological point of view, you've got your amillennialist, you've got your preterist, and they think that all of this is not real. It's all allegorical, and it's just showing us the battle between good and evil. And so when you get to Revelation chapter 21 then, and you get to the new heaven and the new earth, well, all the way through the book of Revelation in particular, and some Old Testament passages. For example, John said back in, I believe it was chapter 13, he said, and I was standing on the shore of the sea, and I saw this beast rise up out of the sea. The next beast rose up out of the earth. And when it says that he rose up out of the sea, the teaching, the implication is out of the peoples, the mass of peoples. And you've been to big stadiums or big gatherings, are seen like, one thing that comes to mind is when they show the marches and gatherings in Washington on that mall up there. And that's what it looks like, a sea. And all those people are milling around and looks like the waves. And so that's what he's talking about. So if you are a millennial and you think everything is allegorized, well, if you're going to keep your allegories running true and straight, well, John says that there was no more sea, so that means there ain't no more people. There's going to be no people in heaven. Well, if you're going to allegorize, you got to do it the whole thing, amen? So what he's saying is there's going to be no more seas, no more water bodies like what we see here today. I don't understand that. I don't know why there would be no more seas except for what the seas do on earth, and I'm talking way above my head right now, is the whole hydrological system and the way that it's all balanced out with the evaporation and the rain clouds and all this stuff. And when we get to heaven, we won't need that, because go back again to Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3. One thing that they didn't have was rain. They didn't need rain. Everything was watered by dew, so their hydrological system, is that the right word? So their hydrological system was completely different than ours. And when you read in Scripture, he talks about when the flood came in Genesis chapter 6, he talked about that the flood waters of the great deep were broken up. And I think that that's when the continents were formed. I think before the flood, it was just one landmass. And you can look at a world map and you can see that, you know, they all fit together pretty well perfectly. And I think that's when the continents were broken up, those fountains of the deep were broken up, and that's when we got the seas and the things that we have now. After the flood is when the hydrological system that we have started. It started raining then, and the canopy of water over the earth was gone, and so all these things started. But when we get to heaven in Revelation 21, we won't need that anymore, because it's going to go back like it was in Genesis chapter 1. So in Genesis, the seas were created. In Revelation 21, no more seas. In Genesis chapter 3, the curse is announced. But when we get to Revelation 21 and 22, there's no more curse. And folks, I know that excites us, but think about it. Because like I talked about Sunday morning, when that curse is gone, no more pain of any kind. No more pain. I begged my doctor to increase my pain medication. But when I get to heaven, before Revelation 21, when I get raptured out of here or resurrected, there'll be no more pain. Nothing that will cause us sorrow will be there. It's going to be, the word that I use is satisfaction. All of our needs, everything will be satisfied. You will never go another time in your existence that you will be needy, because it'll all be satisfied. It'll all be the way God intended it. In the book of Genesis, in chapter 3, death enters history, but in Revelation 21, death is no more. It's over and it's done. In Genesis, man was driven from the tree of life, but in Revelation, man is restored to paradise. And then sorrow and pain begin in Genesis, but no more tears and no more pain in Revelation. So it's just going to be awesome. And if you would, look at Revelation chapter 21 and verse 6, and look what he says. And he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end." And when you go back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, that's the way it starts. In the beginning, God. That's the Alpha. Now we're at the Omega. God, everything began in God, and everything will culminate in God. Colossians chapter 1, I put this in your notes, the verse for it. It's for it pleased God that in him, in Jesus Christ, all the fullness should dwell, and by him to reconcile all things to himself, by him, whether things on earth or things in heaven, having made peace through the blood of his cross. Everything will culminate in Jesus Christ. God was the beginning, God is the end, and God, Jesus Christ, God come in the flesh, Emmanuel, is the middle. So everything centers and focuses around Jesus. We have any questions or any comments? Any thoughts up till now?
That first verse says also there was no more sea. That's a pretty heavy hit that the earth took, whatever happened.
Yes, sir.
Pretty heavy.
Yeah. And if I remember right, I read this just the other day, the earth is 3/4 water, 3/4 sea.
75%.
Yeah, so think about this too now. When we get to Revelation 21, everybody that has ever trusted God from Adam to then is going to be there. So we may need a little more land mass than what we have right now. So maybe that's why there's not any more sea, you know.
We don't need the sea because
Yeah.
we have everything we need.
Does that mean no more fishing or just no more?
No, and we going
He's been researching that part.
yeah, they gonna be some fishing in heaven. The Bible specifically says that. If we get to it, if we don't, next Wednesday night.
Well, I was crying.
It's in Ezekiel, if you want to do a little research between now and next Wednesday night.
But see, it kind of makes me sad
That we're gonna be fishing?
no, that, God created the heavens and the earth, and then all of the things that flew in the sky, and then all of the things in the water, and then all of those things are gonna be gone.
Okay,
And I know that it's gonna be better, but to me, it's kind of.
well, the
it's
sky will
a
still
little
be there.
sad,
The sky will still be there. The earth will be a lot like we know it. It'll just be perfect. Because in Genesis, when you read that there were trees, it would just to make a long, I think that heaven, eternity, is gonna be just like Genesis chapter 1 and 2, before the fall. And remember, God created Adam to till the garden. And when he told him, he said, look, he said, go out, all those trees, all that fruit, and we're gonna see that in chapter 22. You take care of it. So it's not gonna be just this cloudy, floating around thing. It's gonna be a literal earth where we're literally gonna live and do things and, and have things. It's just that it's gonna be back like it was in the Garden of Eden. So you'll still see the sky, trees, there'll be rivers, there'll be lakes, there just won't be any seas. And maybe it's because of the salt content. I don't know. Really, I don't have an answer, but you're not gonna miss the things that we love the most about this world now. It's still gonna be there.
With the exception, you can see the fish and over there.
There was no sea before the flood either.
Sir?
There was no sea before the flood.
I don't think so.
No.
I think that's when that all happened,
Yeah.
yeah. So, there will be some changes, but it will still be, and that's one of the things that a lot of times when I'm out on the lake, in my boat, or I'm out in the woods, like in my stand, or just doing, I look around and I think, man, it's so beautiful. It's just, so when we get to heaven, I can't imagine how, I don't even know, spectacular it's going to be. And the main difference is going to be that there will be no sin. Nothing that is not holy and righteous. And when you go back to other passages in Isaiah, in Ezekiel, and a couple of the other minor prophets, even the wildlife is not going to be wildlife.
Tame.
Yeah, it's just going to be, because that one passage always sticks in my head, and the child will put his hand in the hole of the asp, but of the venomous snake, and nothing will happen. He'll just pat it. It'll be It'll all be changed. So, but I agree with you, and I think about like rainbows. And somebody posted a picture the other day, and I don't think I've ever seen this, but a double rainbow. And offshore, some of the rainbows we used to see out there, man, they were beautiful. And one thing, just let me share this with you, how beautiful sometimes. Somebody had told me about this, and I didn't believe it, but they said that on a clear, perfectly clear night, and in particular when the Gulf is just flat, there's no wind or waves, that if you could somehow be in the middle, you wouldn't be able to tell up from down, because the Gulf would perfectly mirror the heaven. And so one night we had pretty much those conditions. Now, first of all, before I tell you this, it's against the law to do what I'm finna tell you I did, but I did it anyway because I wanted, well, it's past now. So.
Statute of limitations is run out.
Statute of limitation. I turned off all the lights on the platform, and I went up to the heliport, which is above sea level about 180 feet. And I laid down and I eased over as much as I could and looked over, and it was. You couldn't tell. You roll over and look at the sky and the stars, you look back down, and it was just, every star was reflected. It was just a perfect. When you see things like that, then you try to imagine, well, man, if this world, fallen and cursed, is this beautiful and this awesome to behold, heaven, I mean, eternity, goodness gracious, it's going to be awesome. Don't worry, you're not going to miss nothing. Any other questions or thoughts?
And it's coming.
Okay, back in chapter 21 now, and down in verse 9 now, we'll start there. And I don't know how far I'm going to read. It says, then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls filled with the last plagues came to me and talked with me, saying, come, and I will show you the bride, the Lamb's wife. Okay, but all the way through the New Testament, the bride of the Lamb, the bride of Christ, is us, the church. You know, and so when you read this, you get down to verse 9, and you think, okay, he's going to show him all the Christians, the church that is in heaven. And so he said, he carried me in the Spirit to a great and high mountain and showed me the great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God, having the glory of God, and her light was like the most precious stone, like a jasper stone, clear as crystal. And we'll stop there for right now. So when this angel tells John, he says, look, I'm going to show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. He takes him and he shows him the holy city, New Jerusalem. Now, why? Why is the New Jerusalem called the wife of the Lamb? There's all kinds of arguments, all kinds of thoughts. You'll see I left the notes blank there on that page. You're just going to have to look this up and figure it out for yourself. I think it's because we're in the city when it comes down. Okay? Now think about the timeline here. What's just happened? The great white throne has just been completed. 2 Peter chapter 3, the heavens and the earth are either burned up or regenerated, and then a new heaven and a new earth. So while this heaven and this earth is being either destroyed or regenerated, where are we? You know, we got to be somewhere, because we're not just little thoughts. We're real people. And at this point, we've got our eternal bodies. We're going to live forever. Where are we? Well,
We're coming down.
we're in the third heaven. We're in the third heaven at this point, because it says that this earth and this heaven will be either destroyed or
Passed away.
regenerated. So we're in heaven. And so when John sees this vision now, the new heaven and the new earth, and then he saw, remember verse 2, the new Jerusalem coming down, that's where we are. We've been in heaven, and I think we're coming down in this city. And that's why the angel calls it the bride of Christ, because that's where Christ's bride is. Now remember John chapter 14, verses 1, 2, and 3 in particular. And Jesus says, and I'm going to go and prepare a place for you. That's the picture of the Hebrew wedding. The marriage is contracted. They become what we call engaged, but in their wedding system, it's a legal binding thing. Once they get engaged, their parents have arranged this wedding. For that wedding to be called off, it takes a divorce, a legal divorce. So the wedding is arranged, and that happened on the cross and then in Acts chapter 2. The groom goes away back to his father's house, back to his town, to prepare a place for the bride, to build a house, get his work aligned, get everything ready for the bride. And she doesn't know how long this is going to be. And then when it's time, and that's what Jesus is doing now, we talked about this here a while back. Right now, we are in the betrothed stage. We're in the engagement stage. But remember, it's a legal binding deal. It's not like our engagements. It's a legally binding thing. It just hasn't been consummated yet. So Jesus said, I'm going to prepare a place for you. And he said, I will come back for you when it's time and when it's ready. And that's what we're waiting for, to take you so that where I am, there you may be also. So during all of this, we're going to be with Christ during the tribulation period. During the millennial, we'll rule and reign with him. And then at the end of the millennial, when all of this takes place, the great white throne, this fire, destruction, we will be in heaven with Christ in the New Jerusalem. And I think that's why the angel, when he sees it coming down, he tells John, here comes the bride. And that's the first time that's ever been said about me. Here comes the bride, and it's going to be us. Now, just a couple of quick things about this. We got about 15 minutes. In verse 12, it says that the city has 12 gates, and each gate is this humongous pearl and all these things. But it says that the gates all have a name, and the names are the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay? And then in verse 14, it says that the city has 12 foundations. And each foundation is named for the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Okay, well, first of all, my first thought is that the apostles were Jewish also. So the 12 gates are named for the 12 tribes of Israel, the Jews. The 12 foundations are named for the 12 apostles of the Lamb, and they were Jews also. Don't know if that means anything, but I just find it interesting. But what we see in this, in the city, the foundations, we see the coming together of the Old Testament and the New Testament. If there ever will be a time when being Jewish is no different than being Gentile, it will be now in eternity. But remember, we haven't got there yet. 21:22 tells us there will be no temple in heaven. So the Jews won't have that temple experience or whatever. I don't know that there will be no distinction whatsoever between Jew and Gentile, because it says that the gates were named for the 12 tribes. So obviously there's going to be a memory of the 12 tribes of the Jews. The foundations were named for the 12 apostles. They were Jews. The city is called Jerusalem. That's the Jewish city. So there's obviously going to be some reminder of it. But I think more than that, what you see is the Old Testament and the New Testament coming together. I think you see what Christ really intended for the church to be, and that was just be one body. Now, the other thing that I put this at the bottom of the notes on that particular paragraph, also notice that the foundation is the New Testament, the apostles of the Lamb. Now, why is that important? Because your foundation is everything. If your foundation is weak, it is shoddy, it starts to crack or whatever, your whole structure comes down. And so the foundation was not the 12 tribes of Israel, but the apostles of the Lamb. Meaning that everything in the Old Testament, everything in the New Testament is all founded upon Jesus Christ. Everything in the Old Testament, the law, the sacrificial system, the prophets, the Psalms, everything points to Jesus Christ. And I listed you a couple of passages here to read. Luke chapter 24, again, that's Jesus after his resurrection. You remember the two disciples were on the Emmaus road going home, and Jesus appeared to them. They went through all this conversation, and finally Jesus said to them, "Oh, slow of heart and hard-headed, for not believing all that the prophets and the law said about me." And then it says, and beginning with the law, Jesus taught them everything in the Old Testament about himself. So it was all centered on Jesus. And then when you read in Acts chapter 8, Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, the eunuch was reading in Isaiah, couldn't understand what he was reading. Philip said, "Well, let me tell you." And the guy said, "Sure, come on." And it says that Philip began right there and he taught him everything about Jesus. When you remember Peter and Paul going on all these evangelistic missions and thousands of people being saved and churches being started, they didn't do it preaching the New Testament. They did it with the Old Testament, preaching Jesus from the Old Testament. Every time that Peter and Paul went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day to meet with the Jews, and says, and they reasoned with them, or they testified to them that Jesus was the Messiah, they did it from the Old Testament. So if you really think about it, we ought to be able to do everything we need to do today out of the Old Testament. His sufferings were predicted, the cross, everything about him was predicted in the Old Testament, and then we see the fulfillment in the New Testament. So the way he describes the city here, the foundation is Jesus Christ, the doctrine of the apostles. And Paul tells us that the church, the foundation, he said, is laid by the apostles, and that's what people build on. Well, what did the apostles lay? Well, start with Paul himself. He said, "I didn't preach anything but Jesus Christ and him crucified." Peter and John, everything they talk about points right back to Jesus, right back to the cross. Everything in the Old Testament points to Jesus. And so here we see a coming together, and what we will see is the ultimate culmination of everything that God has said and did. I'm going to stop there. We'll talk about the temple and everything next week. I put you some measurements there, and I worked those out as best I could, and those are not mine. I copied them from another book. But basically, the city is going to be 1,500 square miles in general, 1,500 square miles. And so for a comparison, I put down there for comparison, the USA is 2,800 miles from coast to coast and 1,500 miles north to south. So the New Jerusalem would pretty much take up the whole of the United States. So, and when you think about it, 1,500, it's a cube, he said. It's 1,500 miles high, too. So even if we do get mansions, okay, there's plenty of room. How many levels can you put in 1,500 miles high?
12 in this case.
Whew. Yeah. So it's going to be awesome. Any questions, anything about the new heaven and the new earth? Okay, well, next week we'll talk about the description he gives, and we'll talk about fishing in heaven. See if you can find it. It's in Ezekiel. See if you can find it. He specifically says, "I saw the fishermen." I'm not going to say any more because that'll give you too much. You'll be able to look it up in your concordance.